If you were literate, perhaps you had access to the text and you could read the text. If you were illiterate, you could hear these traditions being circulated in oral form. This is how the normal person would receive this type of information. But Muhammad has to bear the heavy burden of these revelations with sweat and the ringing of a bell in these trance-like states to receive information that already existed. It's very strange. Further, we have to ask, what is the Quran? Is it the word of Allah? Or from the previous video on Merkavah mysticism, is it the word of the Mishnah, 2 Enoch, 3 Enoch, Testament of Solomon, Apocalypse of Abraham, the Book of Jubilees? From this video, is the Quran the word of the life of Adam and Eve, the Book of the Cave of Treasures, or the Gospel of Bartholomew? What exactly is the Quran? These are questions I would like Muslims to answer. I'll be looking for your answers in the comments below. Thanks for watching.
Assalamu alaikum and hello to my non-Muslim viewers. Today I'm going to be refuting a video from Islam's critique. So I'm going to try to make this video as short as possible, so I'll just get right to it, get to the point. So basically, Islam's critique is a Christian YouTuber who says that the Prophet Muhammad, he makes these, tired old arguments against Islam and Prophet Muhammad and stuff like that, long refuted arguments. But anyways, so he's repackaging already, refuted shit, basically. But anyways, Islam critique says that the Prophet Muhammad, or the author of the Quran, plagiarized off the Mishnah, 2 Enoch, 3 Enoch, Testament of Solomon, the Apocalypse of Abraham, Book of Jubilees, the life of Adam and Eve, the Book of the Cave of Treasures, the Gospel of Bartholomew. So basically, this Christian critic of Islam or whatever is basically saying Prophet Muhammad plagiarized off Old Testament Apocrypha and these Jewish writings that didn't make it into the Old Testament canon. And he's saying, well, and he compares, the story of Adam and Eve, Adam and Satan to the stories found in various places in the Testament, or the Book of Jubilees, the life of Adam and Eve, the Book of the Cave of Treasures, and then he compares those passages to the Quran and says, well, there's similarities, and that means that these books, the life of Adam and Eve, the Book of the Cave of Treasure, the Book of Jubilees, all these books came before the Quran. That means the author of the Quran, the Quran came after those books. That means the author of the Quran plagiarized off those books, either directly or indirectly. Directly meaning, he had the books and then he wrote down the stories, or indirectly means the Prophet Muhammad heard it and then put it into the Quran and said it's revelation from God, even though, it was from these other sources like the life of Adam and Eve and the Book of Jubilees, etc., etc. So first of all, just because the Quran mentions stories from before, that doesn't mean that the author of the Quran plagiarized off. That doesn't mean the author of the Quran plagiarized off these other, off these sources. Just because the Quran mentions stories about Abraham or Moses or David or Jesus, that doesn't mean that the author of the Quran plagiarized off these these Christian apocrypha or these Jewish apocrypha or the Bible, etc. It simply means that these were true stories maintained in, these Old Testament pseudegraphica or apocrypha in the New Testament, or the Christian apocrypha and the Bible, and the Quran simply came to confirm their authenticity, especially when we take into account that is one of the functions of the Quran. See the Quran chapter 5 verse 48 and the Quran chapter 20 verse 99. So basically, people during the time of the Prophet Muhammad said that the Prophet Muhammad just plagiarized, that he just heard these stories and then he put it into the Quran, Quran chapter 25 verse 5. So this isn't a new accusation. This is a old accusation that critics of Islam in the beginning of the Prophet Muhammad's life, or the beginning of the Prophet Muhammad's ministry, would say. They would say, well, he plagiarized stuff and he put it into the Quran. He heard the stories and put it into the Quran. So what is the problem with that? Now, is that true? No, it isn't. Now, anybody who studies the life of the Prophet Muhammad knows, or studies where the Quran came from and stuff, knows that The Quran was revealed mostly in Mecca. You see, so there were 87 surahs that were revealed in Mecca, and only 27 surahs were revealed in Medina. So these stories of Adam and Abraham and Noah and Isaac and Joseph and Jonah and Job, etc. All these biblical stories found, or these biblical characters found in the Quran, were actually revealed in Mecca. Were revealed in Mecca. So 87 surahs were revealed in Mecca. So what that means is that most of the Prophet Muhammad's life was spent in Mecca. 13 years of his life was spent in Mecca. 10 years of his life was spent in Medina. So according to Ibn Kathir, according to a very important Islamic scholar called Ibn Kathir in his book Qiyas al-Anbiya, he says that most of the stories of the prophets, of these biblical prophets like Jesus, Adam, Abraham, Noah, etc., they were revealed in Mecca. They weren't revealed, most of them were revealed in Mecca. So my question is, with the absence of Jewish and Christian sources in Mecca, how would the Prophet Muhammad plagiarize these stories when there's no influence of Jewish or Christian? There's no Jewish or Christian influence in Mecca. How would he plagiarize if that was the case? So basically, Richard Bell says that in spite of traditions of effect that the picture of Jesus was found in one of the pillars of the Kaaba, there's no good evidence of any seats of Christianity in the Hijaz or near neighborhood of Makkah or Medina. So basically what that means is there was no large communities of Christians in Makkah and Medina. So then the question really arises: where's Muhammad getting these stories from? There's no Jewish or Christian influence in Makkah, because remember, Makkah was mostly pagan. There was almost no Jews or Christians in that area. So then the question really arises: where is the Prophet Muhammad getting the information from? Another problem with this whole theory is that most of these books, like the Life of Adam and Eve, the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of Abraham, etc., most of these Old Testament apocrypha most of them were in. These stories were in Palestine, modern day Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, etc., etc. So these were in the Levant, or these were in the Sham area. The Levant would be Syria, Palestine, Jerusalem, Lebanon. Those places would be the Levant or the Sham area. So basically, Arabia is here, and the Levant is here. So how did those stories go all the way to Arabia? There's no evidence that those stories traveled all the way from, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. There's no evidence that those stories went all the way to Arabia. So those books, the book of the Life of Adam and Eve, the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of Abraham, what else? 2 Enoch, 3 Enoch, Testament of Solomon, the Mishnah, or I'm sorry, not the Mishnah, the Gospel of Bartholomew. These books were, these books were in the north. These books were in Egypt and Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. There's no evidence that those stories went all the way from those areas all the way down, all the way south to Mecca and Medina. There's no evidence that happened. And another problem is, so that's another thing to consider. So basically, anybody who studies, where the Old Testament and New Testament rejected books, these apocryphal books, where they originated from, they originated in, Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, etc. So those stories were circulating in the north. They weren't circulating in the south. There's no evidence that they were circulating in the south. So so that refutes that idea, because the Gospel part, those books were uncovered like hundreds of years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, anyways. So there's no evidence that those stories, either written or orally, were in Arabia at that time. There's no evidence. So the critics have to prove that those stories were already went all the way from Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, all the way down to Arabia. It's impossible to prove that. So there's no way they can prove that. So anybody who studies the life of the Prophet Muhammad knows that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere. So basically, all the critics of Islam, the Orientalists and whatever, say that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere. For example, J.W.H. Storbrat says that the sincerity of the Prophet is found in J.W.H. Shubat, Islam and his founder, page 209. And John Gills, who is no friend of Islam, who's a critic of Islam or whatever, he says that we can safely reject the view that Muhammad was a deliberate impostor and that he was revelations from above. John Gills, Muhammad and the Prophet of Islam. And Arthur Gill Leonard also says that that the Prophet Muhammad had good and great motive. So Prophet Muhammad was sincere, and also William Montgomery Watt says to suppose Muhammad an impostor raises more problems than it solves. Montgomery Watt, Muhammad at Mecca, page 52, and Sir William Moyer also says Muhammad's sincerity. The Prophet Muhammad was sincere throughout his life, and page 54 and page 56. And Sir William Moyer is no friend of Islam. He's actually a critic of Islam. So even these critics, these Orientals and these critics of Islam, say Prophet Muhammad was sincere. Prophet Muhammad was sincere. He wouldn't knowingly plagiarize material and put it into the Quran. There's also other problems with saying Prophet Muhammad plagiarized material or made up the Quran, because if the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, he wouldn't have done two things. He wouldn't have plagiarized. He wouldn't have taken stories that he heard and put it into the Quran and say his revelation from God. And two, he wouldn't have made up the Quran to suit his own needs. So he wouldn't have done those two. So we have to rule out the Prophet Muhammad writing the Quran from his own mind, because people say, even the critics say, Prophet Muhammad was sincere. If the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, then he wouldn't have knowingly made up the Quran. He would have knowingly plagiarized material or made up Quranic verses to suit his needs, or whatever. So that completely refutes that idea. And another issue is that basically anybody who does a study on the Prophet Muhammad's life knows that who is the mysterious teacher that was teaching the Prophet Muhammad. We have every detail of the Prophet Muhammad's life recorded. So so my question is, who is the mysterious teacher or teachers who are teaching the Prophet Muhammad? How come we don't know who they are and what their names are? How come no critic of Islam has been able to reveal the name and the person of the human source behind the Prophet Muhammad's teachings? Even the early Meccans thought Prophet Muhammad was mad, or he was possessed, or he was influenced by magic, etc. So this refutes that idea. Another problem is that the Prophet Muhammad said that Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures. So again, I'll put the reference below. So if that's the case, why would the Prophet Muhammad plagiarize off Jews and Christians when he believed the Jews and Christians already corrupted their scripture? It doesn't make any sense. So how many Jews and Christians among his contemporaries became Muslims and believed in truthfulness? If they knew he was copying from scriptures or learning from their priests and rabbis. So Jews and Christians are converted to Islam during the Prophet Muhammad's life. So if they thought he was an impostor, why did they convert to Islam? Another problem is that the Quran was revealed in the presence of people. The Quran was revealed in a span of 23 years. Where then was that mysterious person or people teaching the Prophet Muhammad? Who are these invisible, these unknown? Who are these unknown Jews and Christians teaching the Prophet Muhammad? How could they be hidden for so long? Or how could Muhammad, who was constantly surrounded by his companions, how was he able to make frequent secret visits to that mysterious teacher or teachers for 23 years without even being caught once. So we don't know. So none of the critics of Islam have been able to pinpoint, the teacher or teachers of the Prophet Muhammad. They don't know who the teachers were. So it's all based on false assumption that the Prophet Muhammad, plagiarized stuff from before. So the problem is there's no evidence that these biblical texts, whether it's the Old Testament or New Testament or the Old Testament Apocrypha or the New Testament Apocrypha, these rejected books like the Gospel of Bartholomew, the Life of Adam and Eve, the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of Solomon, the Testament of Abraham, etc. So there's no evidence that they were in Arabia, first of all, and second of all, there's no evidence that there was major influence of Judaism and Christianity in Mecca, where the Prophet spent most of his life. So that's why there's confusion. That's why no one's been able to pinpoint the source of the Quran. So there's confusion as to who the teachers or teachers of the Prophet Muhammad was. So it makes more sense to say he was getting divine revelation, because the critics would have to prove, they would have to show where the Prophet Muhammad specifically got his information from, what teacher or teachers, what Jewish or Christian teachers were teaching him. If they're not able to do it, then they can't prove that the Prophet Muhammad plagiarized stuff. So we don't. So the source of the Quran says it's from God, in the Quran chapter 53, and other places like that. Quran specifically says that it's from Allah, and the Quran chapter 53 verse 2 to 5, and the Quran chapter 29 verse 48 to 49, and the Quran chapter 25 verse 5 to 6, where it says Allah revealed these stories, or these past stories to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So just because these stories aren't found in the Old Testament or the New Testament, like the stories of Abraham going to Mecca and making the Kaaba, and other stories, just because these stories aren't found in the Old Testament and New Testament, that doesn't mean these stories are false. It just, it's possible that these were true stories, like Abraham going to Mecca, or the stories of Jesus making the clay bird and mid-flying away, and things like that. These were true stories, and the Quran came to confirm their authenticity. And these stories didn't find their way into the Old Testament and the New Testament. So not everything about Jesus is recorded in the New Testament, and not everything about these other biblical figures like Noah, Abraham, etc., is found in the Old Testament. So just because the Quran mentions these extra stories which aren't found in the Old Testament and New Testament about Abraham, Jesus, David, Solomon, etc., that doesn't mean these stories are false. It's possible that these were true stories and didn't find their way into the Old Testament and New Testaments. That's certainly possible, because again, keep in mind, Jews, Christians, and Muslims are without the facts. Especially Jews and Christians, they believe in the Old Testament and New Testament to be historically reliable, but time and time again has shown that both the Old Testament and New Testament has been, corrupted, tampered with. There's false stories in there. We don't know who the sources are behind the majority of the Old Testament and majority of the New Testament stories. We don't know who wrote the majority of the Old Testament books. We don't know who wrote the majority of the New Testament books. So these are problematic things. So that's why we can't trust the Bible, because we don't know who the sources are. We don't know who really wrote the Bible. So when I mean Bible, I mean both the Old Testament and New Testaments. So the whole thing is unreliable. The whole thing is untrustworthy to begin with. But just because the Quran's mentioning these new stories or these unknown stories, that doesn't mean that these stories are false and the Bible is true. No, it's possible that the Quran is mentioning true stories about Abraham going to Makkah, the stories of Solomon and demons, and Jesus making the clay bird, and speaking the cradle. These were true stories, but they didn't find their way into the Bible. That's certainly possible. So again, just because those stories aren't found in the Bible, that doesn't mean that, and they're found in the Quran, that doesn't mean the Quran is wrong, because it's because those stories aren't found in the Bible. No, it's very possible that those were true stories and didn't find their way into the Bible. That's certainly a possibility. So that's all I want to say about this whole Prophet Muhammad plagiarizing off, Jews and Christians and stuff like that. There's no evidence for that. So, these Christian critics like Islam Critique and David Wood, since David Wood loves to bring that topic up, they need to stop using that war and torn argument. So hopefully this video completely debunks that claim. Thanks so much.